Hi, welcome to the webinar, Is Your Email Marketing Trustworthy? Best Practices and Findings from Auditing the Top 200 Retailers. This is a result of the fourth annual report audit that we've done for OTA. My name is Jeff Wilbur. I'm director of the Online Trust Alliance Initiative at Internet Society. And with me today are two experts in email marketing and all the components that make it up. Sam Silverman, he's the Director of Standards and Industry Relations at Constant Contact, also a board member of MOG and very active in the email community. And Sal Trippi, AVP of Digital Operations and Compliance at Publishers Clearinghouse. And Sal has been involved in email marketing for much of his career and has a lot of background and expertise here. So welcome, you guys. Glad you could be part of this today. Just to give a quick overview of what we're doing today, this is our fourth annual audit, as I mentioned. The best practices for this have been developed over the years using a multi-stakeholder input. And we expanded the audit this year to look with more granularity at all the steps, from sign up through mailing, through unsubscribe, and then did you honor the unsubscribe. Every year we look at the criteria and refine them if necessary, or in this case, we added 2 new criteria this year, which we'll talk about as we go along. And just at a high level, the methodology that we follow is we get a list of the top online retailers from Internet Retailer Magazine. It's part of our annual online trust audit where we look at actually the top 500 retailers. We go down the list and we sign up for the marketing emails from them. There are some that we can't do because they require money up front, or you have to be, for instance, a military veteran to be able to sign up, that kind of thing. So we actually went down to number 210 this year to get to our top 200 actual signups. We signed up in March as part of our effort for the online trust audit, and then let it sit for a while, started unsubscribing in August. If we saw that there was no response or something odd, we may have signed up again during that. Probably we did some signups in May, and we did some more actually in August. And so then we kind of let it cook for a while and then unsubscribe and monitor that. And the last unsubscribes we did were in the mid-November timeframe. We have a scoring mechanism against these best practices where there's a total of 100 points possible. And if a company earned 80% or higher of those points and they didn't have a CAN spam or CASL violation, they were named to our best of class. And we'll talk about that more in a minute as well. So what are we trying to accomplish here? If you've been around OTA for any time, you know that one of our mantras is to move beyond compliance to stewardship. So this isn't about, did you clear the minimum bar, which would actually disqualify you if you didn't from this best of class status. But ultimately, we're trying to get the stewardship. Are you doing the right things to give consumers choice and control and honoring the unsubscribes? Ultimately, this improves your level of engagement with subscribers, we believe. And as I mentioned, every year we kind of look at where the bar should be. And ultimately, it ends up getting higher and higher every year. But we see that marketers, in this case retailers, tend to achieve at or above previous year's levels almost every year. So let's start. We're going to kind of go through this chronologically. What did we see in sign up? What did we see in the mail itself? What did we see as we unsubscribed? And then what did we see following the unsubscribe? So we're going to kind of take this in sections. On the front end, the sign-up practices, these are not scored. These are really more observations. But it's interesting to see kind of what the norms are. So we have a couple years of data here. Last year was the first year we looked at this part of the process and captured data on it. You'll see in the unsubscribed side of things, we now have 4 years of data to compare. So on the front end, where was the sign-up placed on the page? 97% is on the home page. Those other 3%, you had to dig a little bit to find it. We kind of did a high-level assessment of, remember, we're going to these sites to say, can we find the subscribe? Because that was our intention, is to subscribe. only 85% were easy to find, which is there's 15% that made it hard to find in one form or another. The most common way of presenting it is at the middle or bottom of the page, there's an open box that says enter email address, and next to it, it says sign up for our promotions or something of that nature. And especially if you're doing this over and over again, you tend to start to see the patterns. And that was the most common presentation. There were others, but again, 15% were hard to find even with the intention of subscribing. Many of the sites, after you hit the home page, would pop up an invitation, say, hey, sign up for our email. Here are some benefits of doing that. That was true this year in 31%. Last year was a little bit higher, but it's very similar. Many of them also offered a promotion to sign up for free shipping on your first order, or a discount on your first order. Again, that was down slightly from last year. And then ultimately, as we signed up, we want to know that it was heard by that site. And 97% of the sites actually gave us a confirmation on the screen. Thank you for subscribing. It might have been a page. It might have been just an addition to the page itself, some extra text. That's up a good amount from last year, which is great. We'd like to see that at 100%. When you sign up and you don't get any kind of confirmation, you don't know whether you've actually signed up, which is an issue. On the data entry side, one of the high-level observations this year is that much less data entry was required. So less retailers asked for the email address to be entered twice to confirm it, make sure there's no typos or issues there. Less of them asked for more information of various kinds, name or address or preferences. We did look at how many required you to enter some aspect of your geographic location this year, whether it's country or zip code or province or state. And that was only 17%. We'll talk about that later on. And then only 11% required account creation. Now that's obviously business model oriented, but it's only about half of what we saw last year. And the list only changed by about 10% between last year and this year in terms of who the top 200 were. So Sal and Sam, I know you guys have some impressions on just this kind of front end of the process. Maybe you can point out some things that you think are important or that marketers often overlook in this part.
Sure. Hey, thanks, Jeff, and thanks for having me as part of the webinar. I think, there's a lot of different ways to go ahead and grow an email list and capture email addresses from your consumers. And I don't think there's any one right way or wrong way of going. What's important from a compliance standpoint and a transparency standpoint is to really do just that. Be transparent, make sure the consumers have access to your privacy policy at the point they're given that email address. Make sure to set appropriate expectations, letting them know what they're going to be receiving emails on. May sound cliche-ish to be transparent up front, but a good, clean list of customers will pay benefits down the road. It doesn't make sense to bring consumers in under one premise and then email them in a totally different way. It only leads to more spam complaints and delivery issues downstream. Now, I know many places are entering email addresses twice, confirming things along that line. And there's a combination, and I know we're going to get into it a little more later on in the webinar, but there's a combination of technology and practices that could make for a nice, clean list.
Great. Yeah, and one of the things that you're going to hear this multiple places during this webinar, but GDPR, the new privacy and data protection laws that are coming into play in Europe in May of next year, one of the things that they're very clear about is, as Sal said, setting those expectations up front. And if you're signing up for one thing and then you ultimately use that email address for some other purpose, then you have violated GDPR. And the fines are huge, up to 4% of your revenue, your worldwide revenue, or 20 million euros, I think it is. So you need to be careful if you've got either EU citizens or people in the EU itself on your subscription list. So that's very important of setting those expectations properly. Sam, did you have anything you wanted to throw in on this slide?
Not really, except I wanted to thank the OTA Internet Society for inviting me for the webinar. I agree with everything that was previously said, and we Constant Contact, we help small businesses versus the larger marketers, and it's really important for these small businesses to understand when they try to acquire addresses through their sign-up pages that they clearly indicate what they want to use them for. So I couldn't agree with the previous comments for.
Great. Yeah, and I'll be asking you along the way, kind of compare and contrast what you see in the small business world with Constant Contact with what we see in these top 200 retailers, which would be, you know, near the tip of the pyramid, I would imagine. So another thing we looked at here is validating the subscription. So there are a couple of ways that can be done. One is to have a CAPTCHA during the process. So you have to validate that you're a real person and not a bot for signups. Summer of 2016, there was a major, what they called a list bomb attack, where bots were signing up for lots of newsletters and promotions and actually flooding certain users' mailboxes with thousands of subscriptions to the point where their mailboxes were unusable. Haven't seen anything like that recently, but a CAPTCHA, of course, or a confirmed opt-in can help slow down that process, at least make it less scalable. CAPTCHA we've seen is kind of flat over the last couple of years. Last year was the first year we assessed that. One of the concerns we have is just use of confirmed opt-in. So this is the idea that you sign up and the first thing you get is an email from that retailer saying, please click this link to confirm your subscription. Only 2.5% of the retailers did that this year. And you can see it's been kind of on a geometric decline the last few years. So do you guys have any impression of why that might be declining, or what the trade-offs are on use of confirmed opt-in? I know there's kind of a debate in the marketing community of whether it's a good thing because it can actually slow down the process and create extra friction where those confirmation messages get lost in a junk mailbox or something, and therefore you lose your subscribers. So Sal, what's your experience with this?
Sure. I think I don't personally believe it's a decline in marketers' desire to make sure they have confirmed opt-ins and people are really subscribing. I think what we're witnessing is an improvement in other technologies out there that help you validate a registration is good at the point of registration. You know, there are third-party tools out there that allow you to monitor the incoming IPs, to validate the email address is real, to validate that it's not a script that's doing it, but actually a real individual. And I think as those tools are becoming more and more mainstream and more companies are using those types of tools, we see a decline in things like that are requiring CAPTCHA, where you have to enter, you know, the symbol to validate you're a human being. And anytime you can remove a barrier from your consumers, it's a good thing from the overall user experience standpoint. So I think we're seeing technology helping marketers get more streamlined and achieve the same results.
That's a great point, and that's probably why we saw a drop in the requirement to re-enter your email address as well. If there's technology on the back end that's able to verify it in real time, then that's less of a requirement, and as you said, less of a barrier for signups. That's great input. Moving on to what happened after we signed up, we kind of looked at, did we get a welcome message? In this case, we used the word confirmation, so it's different than the confirmed opt-in, just kind of a welcome message. And then did we get the newsletters or promotions, or did we get both? And clearly that by far, most of the retailers do both. They give you some kind of confirmation of a welcome message. Thanks for joining. It might have an offer in it. In fact, 48% had an offer in them. to engage immediately. 18% only started just sending the promotions or newsletters. They didn't say welcome. They just started up with the stream that they're sending. And then we had 3.5% that only sent a confirmation or a welcome message, but then never sent anything else. So that seems like it's a broken thing, because if someone signs up, they're expecting some content. So Sam and Sal, I think you both had a comment on that little slice of the pie there.
Sure. I mean, that could be caused by a variety of reasons. One, either marketers are doing dry testing, trying to test their consumers' desire for their email, or it could be, they didn't have any content to provide. They're doing targeted content. So if part of the registration process you didn't browse through, they were not, you didn't fall into any of their targeting segments. My gut feel is more the earlier, doing some dry testing, trying to see if there's a desire for their email.
Yeah. And from a small business marketing perspective, there are many customers who they go through the setup and they collect addresses, and they haven't gotten around to figure out what content they want to market to their customers, and enough time passes when they get around to sending their first set of campaigns to market to their customers. It's enough times past that people don't even realize they signed up, and it's been an ongoing issue that we've tried to promote to our customers, saying, if you're going to do this, do it right, market regularly, don't market too often. And if you don't talk to people on your list, maybe it's time that you think about aging them out.
Right, exactly. We did see a few, I think we may have run into some of what you guys just talked about, because we did see a few examples and we just didn't kind of surface the data where we signed up and it was maybe weeks or more than a month later, we finally did get some content. So they would have fallen into that big 78.5% slice, or because they would have received a confirmation. But it was, questioning why such a gap, because obviously if you have a monthly newsletter, that might be on a certain cadence, but it seems that maybe they finally decided we fit into a profile or whatever the case. So great input there. One of the things we did monitor was the cadence. And of course, this is going to vary widely by business models. And the other thing to note is we intentionally we use Gmail accounts to do this testing. And we intentionally set them not to show images, which is a way that a marketer would know that you had engaged with their email. So as far as they were concerned, we were a completely unengaged subscriber. So no matter how many emails they had sent, they wouldn't have known that we opened them at all. So cadence varied from many a day, kind of the daily deals type sites, to one a month, mostly a newsletter sort of thing. We saw some interesting things though, and we started measuring this last year. So a quarter of them roughly scaled back their cadence automatically as they saw we were unengaged. So they might have started at daily or every other day, and then they backed off to maybe once a week, and then they backed off to maybe once a month. Only 10% of the retailers did that last year. So we saw a big jump up in the cadence scaling kind of automatically. On the other end of the spectrum, we saw 19% just stopped sending. They hadn't ever seen us engage with an email. Some stopped very quickly, 4 days. They didn't give us much time to reply. Some waited 4 months, 120 days. The average was about 2 months. But we saw a drop from last year in how many stopped sending. It almost seems like there's a balancing act here, a shifting, where instead of just stopping altogether, maybe it's better to adjust the cadence and dial it back a little. So Sal, I know Publishers Clearinghouse clearly has its own approach to this, but just in general, why would a marketer adjust the cadence or stop sending altogether when they encounter an unengaged subscriber like this?
Well, a few reasons. One, engagement is becoming more critical in inbox delivery. ISPs are looking at individual consumers' engagement with brand emails when they're making overall placement decisions where to place the email, whether it be in the inbox or the spam folder. So it helps in having a very engaged list and not mailing to dormant people helps overall email delivery. But the other side of the other issue is also, dormant addresses. When an address goes dormant, ISPs either recirculate those email addresses, take them back, put them through a period of dormancy, and then reassign them to people, or they'll turn them into spam traps. So you want to, any brand mailer want to avoid hitting either a spam trap or sending an email to a subscriber that was intended for the previous owner of the email address.
Right. So you run the risk if someone is unengaged, you're running the risk of actually downgrading your deliverability and maybe even raising your spam score or whatever if you're
hitting spam traps. Yeah. Absolutely.
Okay.
Absolutely.
Great. So that would probably explain this kind of combination of scaling back and the stopping altogether. So we're going to continue to monitor this. The next thing we looked at in the mail itself was email authentication, and this goes to the trustworthiness overall. It's kind of like, can I trust that you're going to honor my wishes, Mr. Marketer? But also, can I trust that this email really is from you? And if people are using email authentication properly, it makes it very difficult for others to pretend to be you using your domains. So the two primary authentication methods are SPF and DKIM. DMARC is a technology that allows a sender to tell the receiver what to do with a mail that fails authentication, so they can tell them to put it in a quarantine or like a junk folder or reject it altogether. And they can also get feedback on how their authentication is doing and who might be pretending to be them. So we're seeing nice growth in each. In fact, we're approaching 100% on the main authentication methods. Most of this email for large retailers is sent through third-party email service providers. So this is really dependent on their platforms. Or in the small business case, like Constant Contact, it would be what Sam is doing, making sure that there's authentication available for those smaller businesses. And then opportunistic TLS encrypts the messages between mail servers, so it prevents eavesdropping. And the biggest jump we saw this year, you can see that most of them had nice growth as they're nearing 100%. It's a little slower, but we saw almost a tripling of use of opportunistic TLS from last year to this year. And one of the things, and that would have to be on the ESP's platforms, one of the things we attribute that to is the fact that Gmail, if you look at this picture on the bottom of the page, the screenshot, they actually have been for about a year and a half now showing an unlocked padlock if TLS is not implemented. And it just says it wasn't encrypted on the way into Gmail. And that, even though it's not a sign that it's a bad message or a dangerous message, it clearly is a user indicator that people see. And we believe that and the push from Microsoft, Twitter, Google, and others to implement TLS is one of the reasons we saw such a huge jump year to year there. I know, Sam, you had a comment on, from a small business standpoint, on just your users' challenges on implementing email authentication in general.
Yeah, I mean, one of the things about some of these smaller businesses, they don't have a technical staff. And when they set up these accounts, a lot of times they either outsource it to a small, consultant, or it's their kids, right? They literally call their kids up and say, "Can you set this up for me?" And so when you have, some of these more complicated email authentication systems like DMARC, they just don't really engage it. It's not something that that is on their radar. So, and in order to have publish your own DKIM key versus one that we publish for them, it's a challenge. Someone has to set up DNS and change things around. And engaging these small businesses to get them to do it is a challenge. So we don't see a big adoption in DMARC with our small businesses.
Yeah, you were saying it's in the single digits.
Yeah, it's very low. And most of the customers, I'd say, who do publish their own DKIM records and turn on DMARC are part of larger organizations. They're not the mom and pops.
Gotcha. So there's still a long tail, as they say, of businesses we need to get to on this whole issue and make it, sounds like we need to make it easier for them if they're going to raise their adoption.
That's right.
Yeah, great. So moving on to the actual scored best practices. So I'm not going to read through all these, but wanted to just kind of show this in context of the flow. So the first four are things we looked for in the message. Can you find the link? Did you use terminology that's easy to understand? Is there something called an unsubscribe header in the message which can present a link, a nice link or a button in some of the email clients? The next chunk is the unsubscribe process itself, all the different pages and things interaction you might encounter. This is where our two new criteria came into play. Number 8 there, we were looking for a pre-population of the unsubscribe address, and we'll show an example of that. But this is the idea that I subscribed using a certain address, and when I choose to unsubscribe, do you automatically put that in the box or at least show me on the page what it is, or do I have to remember? And that sounds trivial, except that a lot of people merge everything into one mailbox, like multiple addresses. And so maybe you don't remember which address that was generated from. And then number 11 is encrypting the session for the unsubscribe page. That's the other new one. So this is the idea that when I click unsubscribe, usually I get a page that pops up, and is it using HTTPS? Because I'm exchanging at a minimum my email address and maybe more in that interaction, and we'd like to see that be encrypted. So that was a new criteria added as well. Then we look at how are you honoring the request? Do you remove it immediately or take your time? And then ultimately, are you complying? And then the other factor there is the first bullet under additional factors is, do you send an unsubscribed confirmation email like, we confirm that you have unsubscribed? This is considered a bad practice. Depending on what exactly is in the message, it could be a compliance problem. Most of what we saw this year were not compliance problems, but we did see a handful of retailers who sent that confirmation. So that's a penalty. It actually deducts points. So looking at the all the numbers on one sheet here in terms of the scoring, you can see that we've tracked most of these for several years. Most of them are creeping up year to year. There have been some kind of dips and jumps depending on which one we're looking at, but most of them are up in the 90% adoption range, at least for the key ones. The two new criteria are shown there in the blue. The one that is concerning this year is clear and conspicuous. So that's the discoverability of the unsubscribe link itself. Can I find it? So we're not going to talk about all of them on this sheet because we're going to kind of dive into each one by one. But wanted you to see it all in context here of the kind of adoption rates that we're seeing. Then we look at unsubscribe results, what actually happened. So you can see, as I mentioned, there were a handful that sent unsubscribe confirmation emails, the number that immediately stopped sending. So we give them 1 day of grace in case they had a campaign queued up. So if we unsubscribe on the 5th, if they send a message on the 6th, that's allowed, but anything beyond that, we don't count. So that continues to rise. 88% immediately stopped. We saw somewhat flat overall violation of canned spam, although part of that was due to a new criteria we looked at this year. So failing to honor the unsubscribe, in other words, sending after 10 business days, actually went down from 6% to 4%. But there were 3 sites, I believe, that did not have an address in their email, and that's one of the requirements, a physical or a postal address in the email itself. And so that was a new thing we looked at this year, and that kind of totaled up to being flat for compliance problems. In terms of the retailers who didn't honor the unsubscribe, there were 8. One of them seemed to be in compliance and then suddenly started sending again from another domain, which is usually an indicator that they are using a different email service provider. So they didn't pass off the list properly, most likely. 2 of them were right on the edge. They sent just one message after the 10 days and then stopped on their own. So they were flirting with the with the edge of compliance there and actually went over the edge. 2 of them stopped after we unsubscribed a second time. So maybe the initial one was broken, or we aren't sure exactly what happened there. And then 3 just never stopped, even though we unsubscribed multiple times. So those are the clear major violators. Sam, Sal, do you guys have comments on just this honoring of the unsubscribe itself?
Yeah, I mean, from my perspective, losing a consumer is never a good thing. You never like to see it happen, but I'm hoping they're all technical reasons why they're not processing them immediately as opposed to 10 days. There are marketers that feel, well, I can get another 3 or 4 or maybe 5 or 10 messages out to consumers before I legally have to remove them from my list. And that's, that in my opinion is an unfortunate way of thinking, in that, maintaining consumer trust and honoring those as soon as possible is really the way to go. I mean, one of the things we spoke about, Jeff, as we were going through this was, at PCH, we see a lot of customers come and go back and forth on their own. So even though they're unsubscribing, it's usually not for extended period of time. People tend to subscribe and resubscribe at certain times. Retailers around the holiday season, the same type thing. People are engaged with the emails when they need it, but then bail out when they're no longer in the market for whatever it is they were looking for. So trying to, maintain that trust with the consumers and respect of the consumers on the unsubscribe process is, in my opinion, almost as important as the welcoming process and sending, appropriate emails on the way in.
Got it. Good point. And Sam, what's your experience with the smaller businesses and how they, I mean, I know you guys have the system set up to kind of implement this unsubscribe, but what do you see in terms of their desire to do that and kind of conform to the rules?
Well, so most of the small businesses, they actually use our service for the unsubscribe because it's something they just don't have to deal with, right? We handle that for them, and they have a lot of comfort in knowing that we'll do the right thing. And so where the problems usually arise are like where, I have a customer and they have multiple services that send email. So it might be a nonprofit and they use us for some email marketing. Then they have a donor product that tracks and asks for donations, or maybe a different event product which looks for volunteers. And syncing those systems together, making sure the unsubscribe gets propagated to all the systems can be tricky. Usually, these slightly larger organizations, they automate it. So they don't have to think about it. They either do it themselves or get a third party to sync all the unsubscribe lists. But some of our small businesses and small organizations, they do it by hand because they don't either have the money, they don't have the time, they don't have the technical know-how. And so it's not uncommon to have a nonprofit sync their donor list with another service, with our email marketing, and their standard policy is, well, before I send that next campaign, I better make sure the unsubscribes are synced so I don't have a problem. And it works most of the time, but every now and then someone gets the order wrong, right? And then you have an issue.
Sure.
So that does happen from time to time, and we try to reinforce the rules and make sure they do the right thing moving forward. The other big trick is when we onboard a new customer, we ask, hey, do you have an unsubscribe list from wherever you came from? And sometimes they don't get the right list, and they will send email, and there'll be a mix of people that they still have permission to send, and some that have unsubscribed from somewhere else, and that's always a problem, and we have to work with them to make sure they don't do that again as well.
Yeah, so you really need to pay attention to your lists and how current they are, and make sure they get handed off properly especially between services, as you mentioned. So yeah, it's a great
If I could just jump in on something Sam was saying. Sam mentioned that a lot of companies are automating the process, and larger companies typically do automate, and anybody with the resources is going to automate that process. One of the most important audits we conduct on a regular basis, but at no less than every other month, is an unsubscribe audit, where we're testing our automation, because we all know what happens with automation. You set it up, it's working fine. Somebody changes something on the back end, and all of a sudden it's not working. So if you do have an automated process, it's really important to, on an ongoing basis, do an audit to validate that the process is still working as it was originally intended.
That's a great point, Son. You said you do that once a month?
We try to do it once a month, no less than once every other month.
Okay, fantastic. All right, so kind of wrapping up the summary portion of this here, and then we'll kind of do some quick examples of each of the best practices. That best of class category, where you're at 80% or higher and no compliance violations, it's relatively within a pretty tight range here year to year, even though we keep raising the bar. And we see a similar thing in our online trust audit annually, that in fact, in that case, even though we raise the bar, the achievement grows slightly each year. In this case, it dropped a little bit. Most of the decline this year was due to three things. One was, the unsubscribe link was hard to find. Another was the new criteria of encrypting your session to the unsubscribe page that knocked a few people out of the best of class. And then the three retailers who didn't have a physical address in their message, they would have been in that best of class, but got kicked out of qualification altogether by violating that can spam rule. There is a report on our website that goes through all this in much more detail. The appendix lists everyone who's best of class. And just wanted to point out that, since we've been doing this 4 years, there are a number of sites that have achieved that best of class for 4 years. You can see some of the names here. And then the other thing we added to the nomenclature this year is the little caret indicator. And that is for sites that actually implemented all aspects of the email authentication and security. So they do SPF and DKIM and a DMARC record with some kind of policy statement of reject or quarantine, and they do TLS. So we wanted to kind of give both aspects when we highlighted these companies that are kind of setting the pace for everyone else. We did have 9 sites with perfect scores this year. These are the 9 listed on this slide. In parentheses, if they're in bold and in parentheses, they've done it multiple years in a row. So we have 2 that are kind of 4 for 4, Blue Nile and CR Trading Post. They both also have great email authentication, as you can see. And so we're glad to see that. It's actually declining year over year in general. We see 23 perfect scores in 2015, 12 last year, just 9 this year. That criteria that requires encrypted sessions to the unsubscribe page actually knocks 6 of the retailers out of the perfect score category this year. Otherwise, there would have been 15. So it's not like we're seeing less achievement here. It's just as we raise the bar, it's going to affect those who can achieve it. So we wanted to talk real quickly about all these different criteria, and we have only got about 15 minutes left total, so I'm going to fly through a lot of these. But in terms of discoverability, we looked at where was the unsubscribe link placed. So, and this is the first year we've done this. Was it in a standalone kind of footer where individual words might, 3 or 4 words across, like you see in that example of privacy policy, web view, and unsubscribe here. That's what we considered kind of a standalone footer sort of presentation. The middle category here is a standalone sentence. And then the third is you kind of have it buried in a paragraph. And you can see that about half are using a footer, a little over a quarter in a sentence, and about 20% in a paragraph. And even though we hadn't measured this in previous years, it seemed to be that there was a trend toward either making it more discoverable or less. There wasn't much middle ground. So we saw a lot more footers than we had in previous years. Even though we didn't count them, you kind of get a feel for that. And more sentences and less buried in a paragraph. And I know, Sam, you had some comments about the kind of the two camps that senders tend to be in terms of how they view unsubscribe. So maybe you can tell us about that.
So I'm sorry, the question was around
the two camps that senders tend to be in terms of how they view the whole unsubscribe thing and how prominent they want to make the link.
Oh, so I think there's a camp that, as you expect, are they want to engage with their customers, and if their customers say, I'm not interested in the mail anymore, they're happy to take them off the list because they want the engaged customers. They don't want to annoy them, right? I mean, it's about providing good service for your customers. And then there's the other ones who feel that every address is sacred, right? So they all want my mail, and I don't think they really intend to unsubscribe. They want to believe that it might be a mistake. So they want to give that subscriber every opportunity to not opt out. And so some of them will even go as far as to want to make that unsubscribe link less conspicuous. And that's just not how we like to do business. We really feel that consumers have a right to say they don't want their mail, and why not make it easy?
Exactly.
Otherwise, they'll push the spam button. They'll do other things to block the mail. So there's really not much point into making it difficult.
Yeah, your risk is high if you're offending the customer. They start to click the spam button. That's way worse than just having them individually unsubscribe. Sal, I know you said PCH has an approach toward presenting the unsubscribe link, to make sure that people kind of know what to look for.
Well, we try to stick with the industry standard, bring it down to the lower part. We don't try to bury it within a paragraph or anything. Obviously, we don't publicize it. We don't, say, hey, and have flashing lights around it. But we want to, go industry standard. If somebody wants all our lists, yeah, that makes us sad, but we'd rather have them come back. Again, it gets back to honoring what the customer wants. So letting, most people know it's kind of industry standard. If you're looking to get off a list, you scroll to the bottom of the email, at the end of the content, have a list that's easy for them, have a link that's easy for them to find, and then place no barriers. Process it as soon as possible and give them the opportunity. If you have a respectful process on the way out, they're more apt to come back to you if they want to come in.
Yeah, absolutely. Sam, I think the words I remember you said were you're either in the embrace the unsubscribe camp or the fear the unsubscribe camp. And I think that kind of sums up that whole approach very well. So one of the other things we looked at was text size. And I'm not going to spend a lot of time on this. It is one of our criteria. So there's a lot about web design and how people approach this and what are the right standards. But generally, things on web pages are measured in kind of px or pixels, and that's the standard that's used. And so anything less than 10, we didn't count as being properly sized. 10 is kind of on the edge, and anything bigger than 10 was fine. Just for reference, 12-point printed type that we're kind of used to in a document is 16 pixels on a page. So it's roughly a 75% ratio. So when you get under 10 pixels, you're down in the 6 or 7 point type. sort of range, just if you can wrap your head around that. So there's some examples shown here of 8-point, that was the lowest we saw this year for the unsubscribe link, 10-point and 12-point type. Or not point, I'm sorry, pixel. Confuse myself here. The other thing we looked at in more detail was contrast. So there's a lot of design that's tending toward light on light and very subtle and thin fonts, and it makes it harder to read anything, much less the unsubscribe link itself. So there are web guidelines, a minimum of a contrast ratio of 4.5 to 1, kind of at the crude level, let's say, and then 7 to 1 for best readability. About a third of the links that we saw were under even the minimum guidelines, and more than two-thirds were under the enhanced guidelines. Here are some examples sort of side by side on contrast. So this was the lowest we saw, 1.8 to 1. And even though that's nicely separated from all the other text as a link, it's very difficult to read, especially if you had your brightness turned way up. Here's one that was kind of right on the edge of that crude level, 4.2 to 1. This was one of the most common we saw, this kind of brighter blue against white. That's 6.6 to 1. And then this one is approaching black to white, which is, in a pure sense, would be 21 to 1. This one was 19.4 to 1. So gives you a sense of the range that we saw there. Here are some examples, kind of the good versus bad examples. So in this one, this is the unsubscribe link. So it's not underlined, it's not bold, it's not higher contrast or different color, nothing. And you have to hover your mouse over that to even know that it's a link. That's probably the best counter example of how to do it. And then this is one of our 100% scores here at a Trading Post, where they've just got a footer. It's got a lot of words in it, but they're each individual links right at the bottom, very easy to find. Here's another set of contrasts. So this one is sort of similar to the one we saw earlier with no, I think in reality, this word unsubscribe here is in bold, but it's very hard to discern. So a lot of this discoverability depends on not only contrast and text size, as we saw, but contrast with surrounding text. So if it was blue versus black text, it would be easier to find, as we see in this Blue Nile example. Underlining it as a link, bold. You know, there are a lot of ways to distinguish it. How much separation is there between it and everything else? So just encouraging strong discoverability, and as Sal said, consistent discoverability, so that people kind of know what to expect. So one of the other criteria is using commonly understood terms. By far the most predominant, 95 or more %, is unsubscribe. A couple sites used opt out as the term, but something like click here to modify your subscription practices is not a good way to do it, because your brain has to process all these words, and then probably the here is underlined, and it just makes it very difficult to find, even if you're looking for it. We did find the first time we've calculated this data, we found that 76% actually used the word unsubscribed, or I think in one case opt out, as the link itself to click, which is a great practice. We'd like to see that be even higher. Here are some examples on both ends of the spectrum. Again, here, this bottom one, the word unsubscribe, nicely separated in a footer, very easy to find, and it's very clear what that's going to do. Here's one that says, if you do not wish to receive other marketing or promotion emails from us, click here. So again, even though that's its own sentence, it's still difficult to kind of process from a terminology standpoint. The header in the message, if you put it in there, it can be revealed in the email client to be a link or a button in some cases. And so some of the leading mailbox providers actually take advantage of this. This is an example in Gmail, where if you have that header, it'll reveal it as a link here. So that's the same as clicking the unsubscribe link at the bottom of the page. And then they're starting to show up in some of the mobile clients as well. So this is a best practice. It only applies to those email clients that are actually utilizing it. and even if you were sending to Gmail, they may be reading it in another client, but it's still a best practice. You can see that the adoption is up in the 92% range. It's required that you give the user a mechanism to opt out of all email. And we can see that's approaching 100% here, just shy of it. And so that is a well-adopted best practice. Here are a couple examples. One is very simple here. There's a button, unsubscribe from all. It can't be any clearer than that. Etsy kind of gives you a couple different choices. If you want to be removed from all email lists, click here. If you want to customize what you're going to get from us, click here. So it gives you a couple choices, but again, it's very clear, all or make some other intermediate choices. So that's a good best practice. One of our new criteria this year was pre-populating the email address. We have tracked this for a few years, but it wasn't a scored criteria. That's why this is shown in italics. So, but we are seeing growth in it, up in the 95+% range now. This is a significant issue for people who may merge multiple email addresses into one inbox, and they don't know which address they use to subscribe to a given message. So when you're presented with, and even going through our testing, we had a couple different addresses we were using. It becomes confusing if they give you a blank box. So anyway, that's something that's very important to do. Providing a confirmation page so people know that you have unsubscribed them is important, and we saw a 100% level this year, which is great. Here are a couple examples of that. It can be as simple as your email address has been unsubscribed, or as complicated as a nice, well-branded page that says, sorry to see you go, but give us some feedback. We believe that page should be branded so that people kind of stay in a similar environment, and we can show some contrasting examples here. These are the more abrupt examples. So-and-so has been unsubscribed, or are you sure you want to be unsubscribed or removed from our list? This is literally the entire page that we saw on these top two examples versus a well-branded page that kind of keeps you into the look and feel of that site. One of the other things we looked for was the use of a preference center or opt-down. So this is, give me some other choices of the types of emails I get or how frequently I get them. That was almost exactly flat year to year. But it is a best practice to rather than all or nothing, give the user kind of an intermediate choice. So we see a couple examples here. Bonton kind of rolls it all into one. They say, change your frequency, change your preferences of the types of emails you want to get or the subject, or unsubscribe from everything altogether. So they've kind of hit all the, checked all the boxes there. Avon, this is an opt-down choice, or all, get rid of all. So again, there are a variety of ways to do this. And then finally, in terms of the interaction with the customer, you might want to get feedback on why they're leaving. We saw a slight dip in that this year. Here are a couple examples of how some companies have approached that. So this is after you've confirmed that they've unsubscribed. You see next to the fish. They give you some choices on why you unsubscribed, or you can kind of fill in the blank there. And that's another best practice. And then finally, the encrypting the unsubscribed session. It was the new criteria this year, and about a little over half of the retailers did that. So this is important to secure the information. And since some of the pages are hosted by retailers themselves on their website, and some are hosted by the ESP, just need to make that connection and make sure that it is it's done properly. So we've already talked about removing without delay. And I want to jump to one thing I know Sal wants to comment on, then he's got to hop off. Is protecting your data is a key thing. Sal, you want to jump in on that?
Sure. Sure. I think, we all talk about protecting your list and making sure data is secure. It's real important to also remember the unsubscribed list is also PII and should be protected with the same standards that you protect your active list. You know, unfortunately, CAN spam requires you to carry a lot of baggage with unsubscribed lists in perpetuity. When somebody unsubscribes, you got to maintain that list for as long as you're doing email marketing. So the list tends to get very large. So using proper encryption, storing that, not sharing your unsubscribed list is critically important.
Yeah. I know you wanted to make that point because it's essentially a liability, right, that you're hanging on to, and you got to make
Absolutely,
sure
sir.
protecting it properly. So thanks for that. I'm going to go on another minute or two. I know we're a little bit over, but I know Sal had to drop. So I'm going to go back a slide and just kind of wrap this up. So one of the things that comes into play, and I mentioned it earlier, is GDPR requirements for this coming year. And there are requirements based on either citizens of the EU, wherever they happen to be in the world. So it's not just physically in the EU, or for anyone who's in the EU at the time that they sign up, even if they were just visiting. So these criteria have to do with being very transparent about what you're going to do with their data, setting expectations, and then giving users an opportunity to know what data you have on them and actually potentially remove it upon their request. And so we strongly encourage retailers and marketers in general to be collecting that kind of information on the front end so that you know which regulations you need to comply to for that given subscriber. And that's why we were concerned that we saw only 16% of the sites, or 17, asked for geographic location information during the sign-up process. And then finally, just to kind of summarize, if you extract out kind of where we saw gaps and where improvement could be made, these are kind of the points that we would make. You want to verify the entire process. Sal talked about, auditing the unsubscribe on a regular basis. Consider implementing that kind of sign up, or maybe using the technology behind the scenes to verify that users are not bots. Make sure there's a link between subscribing and sending newsletters and it's not broken in the handoff process. Look at all these unsubscribe processes and make a conscious decision about whether you want to use them or not. We're not saying you have to use all of them, but we're recommending that those are all best practices, and you don't want to just go through the motions and not make a conscious decision about any given one. The new criteria about encrypting your unsubscribed pages, and then of course honor the unsubscribes as quickly as possible. Ultimately, we believe this will increase user engagement and trust, and lead to benefits, as we've talked about. Even though you might not want users to unsubscribe, allowing them to do so and honoring their choices is ultimately the best thing to do. And it goes to that whole point about stewardship versus compliance. We do have a number of resources on our site. The links are listed here. You can always email me about these topics, wilbur@isoc.org. And that'll wrap it up. If anyone does have any questions, we can hang on here. I'm going to stop the recording at this point, but can go for a few more minutes if anyone has any questions.